Today, I want to welcome Mickie Kennedy with eReleases. I'm really looking forward to this podcast because Mickey's going to clarify some things that have been confusing for me in my business regarding PR. He started eReleases 25 years ago to help small businesses, authors, and startups increase their visibility and credibility through tier one press release distribution. And a couple of things are really interesting. Mickie lives in the Baltimore area, not far from some of my family. And it turns out I used to live down on the North Carolina coast, very close to where he grew up. And it's, as we've talked, we realize that, it's a really small world. And so my recommendation is if you're a business, you want to listen to this because I think there's going to be some shockers. There have been for me in my conversations with Mickie about what's out there for getting press for your business and some misunderstandings. So listen up. This is going to be good. Mickie, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So anyway, the kind of going back to um, you grew up on North Carolina coast. Those in North Carolina call the area down east, but basically close to Emerald Isle, a little bit north of Jacksonville. I used to live in Havelock, which if you're on the coast, that's where Cherry Point Marine Corps Air Station is. And I was like a really crappy student in high school. I had 2.54 GPA. That's why I went in the Marines, and ended up going to Craven Community College to get my GPA up so I could eventually be accepted to NC State. Now you went to George Mason, which is just an amazing university. Would you go there to study?
So I had finished a bachelor's degree at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina, and was really bit by the writing bug and had always written creatively growing up, but I really fell in love with poetry. So I did a master's of fine arts in creative writing with an emphasis in poetry at George Mason University. And so, that I basically spent 3 to 4 years writing poetry, reading poetry, learning the craft and just getting to explore and love literature. So I had no regrets about that. But career-wise, I wasn't sure what I was going to end up doing. I think my game plan was to, after I graduate, wait tables and to write poetry. And I did that for a summer after graduating and realized that the serving life is not for me. My back hurt, my ankles and knees hurt, and I just felt so psychologically wiped at the end of every shift that I wasn't getting any reading or writing done.
Wow. Now you have a book of poetry that's coming out in a couple of years, right?
Yeah, I have a book of poetry called Worth Burning that just settled on the contract, and it'll be coming out in February of 2026. So a long lead time, but small presses tend to take a long time for production.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, fortunately, I think you know somebody that's good at promoting it, getting the word out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before we jump into that, I'm just curious, what type of poetry do you write? What type of poetry do you read?
So I read very similar poetry to what I write. It's usually first person narrative. It's free verse, non-rhyming, but there is a strong attention to the music of the lines and the words. And it's mostly just about my life and, my experiences and, things along those lines. I've had a very colorful and different little path through life. Never studied, business or marketing, and then all of a sudden I'm in charge of a press release business, starting in October of 1998. So it's been a lot of fun, and there's been a lot of little ups and downs personally as well as professionally along the way.
Yeah. So this is going to seem out of left field, but I'll connect the dots here. Have you ever watched Johnny Cochran's closing statements in the O.J. Simpson trial?
I recall having watched it, but it's been a long time, of course.
Yeah, so most people, I mean, I think the perception of a lot of people is closing arguments is like this whole 5 minute statement. And, the reality in that trial, the closing statements went on for hours, given by multiple attorneys. And I watched it. Somebody had recommended that I watch it, and I did. And what struck me was a lot of his closing arguments he put in meter. And everybody knows if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And
Sure.
that was memorable. But when you go back and look at it, you will see, I mean, he put an enormous amount of effort in it. Basically, he was doing poetry. And it hit me that the things that he wanted the jury to remember, he put in meter. Some of the stuff that I guess he had to put in there just to have an argument for, appeal or whatever, he would just kind of read it out like, you're reading a, earnings report from a, company. And I just found that really, really fascinating. And so when you talked about having, unrhymed poetry, it immediately my mind went to Johnny Cochran and the power of communication that comes when you put things in meter.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, poetry is one of those things that people can still recite lines from decades ago, and I think it's because of the flow and rhythm and the meter, all those things that makes, poetry so beautiful, and one of the reasons that, people still write it and read it.
Yeah. Well, very cool. So obviously you're going to be using e-releases to promote your book. Tell us what is e-releases and just kind of setting the stage. I
Sure. So,
th-
I I mentioned that I waited tables at the end of that summer after graduating. I realized I needed a safe office job. So I applied and was immediately hired by a telecom research startup as employee number three. And, I thought that was exciting, and it was. And you wear a lot of hats when you're, a three-person company. And so one of the things that they had me do, since I had a writing background, was to write press releases and send them out. At the time, we faxed, and the owner of the company was really proud. He had just bought this very expensive fax machine that held 100 telephone numbers, and unfortunately our list of journalists was like 150. So I would program 100 numbers in and send the release and then delete all of those numbers and put 50 in. And I really appealed to the boss to, let's buy a second fax machine so we can keep the 100 numbers stored and 50 in the other. And he's just like, it was too expensive. I think it was like $3,000 or $4,000 at the time. And this was, like mid 90s. And so, yeah, I would write these releases, send them out. And I'll be honest with you, nothing happened. And I really made it my mission to figure out what I was doing wrong. And, I'm naturally curious in life. And it's one of the things that I guess makes me me. I know a lot about a lot of different subjects because I get really curious and I do deep dives into things. And so I started studying articles that journalists were writing. And what I noticed back then is that a lot of the stories, even if they're very small articles, still like to follow a story arc. And I just felt like I'm just sending data to these journalists and I'm not really giving them any materials to build a story. And so I know that we had done a press release on the telecom traffic to and from the United States to various Caribbean countries. We had just finished that area. And, so I looked at that and said, what's the story here? And I noticed that one country stood out. I can't even recall what country it was, but at the time, the reason that the telecom traffic to and from the United States was so robust in that country is it was the call center for 1-900 numbers. It turns out at the time, 1-900 numbers were really popular. You could call and for 75 cents a minute get your horoscope. You could call for $2 a minute and get advice on your pets or, dating advice, all different kinds of things. And so it turns out that was where a lot of that was taking place. And so I wrote a press release about that, sent that out, and it immediately got picked up in the Financial Times, The Economist, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and 3 telecom trade publications. And I was like, wow. And the phones just continued to ring for days. We got lots of orders from people. And, it just really boosted us considerably. I continued to look for stories rather than, just publishing the data. And the media was still kind to us. We still got lots of media pickup. I remember that we noticed that when there was an increase in telecom volume in, countries that weren't quite industrialized as much as like first world countries, it was often followed 2, 3, 4 years later with huge economic growth. So if you see a 7% spike in internet or telecom tech activity for a few years, it usually precedes a huge bump in that country's financial success. And that led to a lot of investment firms and hedge funds all of a sudden buying our data and reports. And it was just really great to be able to turn on all of these avenues for leads and customers and to get this recognition. We were just really killing it. We were really recognized in the telecom world as being like, the gold standard of telecom data. And I just felt to myself that, wow, this could, really help a lot of small businesses. But I didn't do anything with it at first. And then all of a sudden, we started getting calls and calls from journalists after every fax send saying, hey, could you in the future email us instead of faxing? Email was fairly new at the time and people were getting very comfortable with it. And so that was my moment where I mentioned to my boss, I was like, hey, you could build a really robust database of journalists and just email them releases. And he goes, hey, maybe there's a business there. So I spent about a year reaching out to journalists that they were everywhere on message boards, bulletin boards, which were really popular. They were very accessible. And I would reach out to them and just to say, hey, I'm working on this project. It wasn't eReleases at the time, but I told them that I would like to send them releases and could I sign them up? And at first I was going to keep it technology. And as I was speaking to these people, they're like, oh, I don't really do technology now. Now, of all things, I've been, something completely random like restaurants or sports or fashion. And I was just like, wow, people really move around a lot. And so I just started, building out all different types of industries and adding people. And so a little over a year later, I had 10,000 journalists in my database. And I launched the business. And as people, would have a release or want me to write a release, I'd write one and then send it out. And I was doing this on the side, mostly in the evenings and early mornings. And eventually, it reached a point that I felt like there's a business here. And so I left the telecom world and sort of never looked back.
Wow, that's cool. There was, let me drill in on one thing. You talked about the difference between putting out data and telling a story. And just as a kind of an anchor point for everybody's mind, two anchor points. One, Steve Jobs famously said the most powerful person in the world is a storyteller. And the news magazine 60 Minutes, probably the most successful news show of all time, the guy who founded it, his directive to his staff was tell me a story. Every 60 Minutes episode is telling a story. So that makes sense. But here's where I get a little bit lost. What's the difference between putting out a press release for data? So let's talk about this telecom data that you had. What's the difference between putting out data and telling a story? What's the data press release look like? What does the story press release look like?
So the data one looked like had a table in it, and it just showcased the telecom inbound and outbound traffic for each of these Caribbean countries. Sort of talked about the landscape of the telecom market in that area, and it really didn't have anything that was really story specific. We hadn't drilled down and determined why one country stood out more than all the others as far as traffic. We just talked about how robust it was. And to be honest, we do the data, but we didn't know why there were anomalies in the data, why one country was so much more robust, and it wasn't hard to find out. I just looked at that data and I called around and found out, oh, there's a lot of 1-900 call centers there in that country. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And that certainly explains why there's so much traffic there. And so just sharing that kind of information, it's more story based. So, we mentioned the data when we talked about the story based one, but we just sort of talked about how much larger it was than the other markets and what specifically the inbound and outbound traffic was in millions of minutes. And so, it wasn't a table of data. It was just, incorporated in the body of the release where we talked about the call centers, and we talked about how call centers had grown over the years and all the different ways in which people were utilizing it and all the different facets of things that were available. And it just really captured people like, oh, I know 1-900 numbers, but I never really thought about there's corporations and businesses and infrastructure behind that. And it's just interesting that it was sort of one of the earliest things that was offshored to sort of save cost and keep costs down.
Wow. And I think there's so many things in life that have a story. And and I think you can really captivate the imagination. I remember one time I was visiting Phoenix, and I was up on one of the hills. I forget what mountain it was. And I'm looking down the city, and I'm looking at this massive city in the desert. And I still don't know the answer to this, but I was like, why did people settle here? Why is this one of the largest, most significant cities in the country in the middle of the desert? There's a small river going through it, but not a major waterway. And what I'm hearing you say is in your press releases, the ones that really get traction are the ones that connect meaning to the data. It's not just data, but it's having meaning, and it's meaning in a narrative form.
Yeah, I mean, I think that stories are one of the things that naturally we're comfortable with. We grow up, hearing stories, being told stories at night, and they all, sort of follow a story arc that we're comfortable with. And I think it's a natural place that for us to go to. And I think also, there's something about, sharing, a human interest element at times that people resonate with. I know that a lot of small businesses that I've worked with over the years like to appear very corporate and professional as if they're a large company. And I find that a lot of the startups that come through, they do really well with PR. And I think the difference with them is they embrace their bootstrapping. They're very comfortable talking about, building it out of their garage or a workshop or, a leased warehouse in a rough part of town. And they also have their elevator pitch down really solid, which where they can say in just a few sentences, what they're about and how they're different than everybody else in the market. That unique selling proposition that really defines them as unique in the marketplace. And I think that, but one of the things that they love to do, you can even look at Shark Tank and see how people come out and they first start, they hit you with their story, how this business came to be or the circumstances in their life that led to them starting this business. They were laid off or they lost a spouse or a loved one. Maybe they had a hobby and they're trying to figure out if they could start a business after being laid off. And so, I think one of the reasons that people do that is it really gives that immediate empathy where you see not just a business, but you see a person. And I think that along with story goes really far in capturing our attention and wanting us to feel and move throughout an article. And I think that's one of the reasons that, if you are a small business, own it. I have people who will make up media contacts because the person answering the phone is them and they're the only employee at the business. And I'm just like, you really don't have to do that. Journalists are completely comfortable dealing with, solo practitioners, and they actually like it when they call that they're speaking to someone who knows what they're talking about because it's, you're running the business. And so, but yet I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something really key there. There's something really key there. Think about when they call and they talk to the owner of the business, they are talking to the expert who can answer all of their questions. When they're talking to a media contact, I mean, how many times does the media contact have kind of a watered down understanding or even a misunderstanding that's going to need to be corrected, or or they won't be able to answer all the journalists' questions?
Yeah, it happens more times than not where they're like, let me take your information down and circle back with you once I've talked to the person involved in this. And it can be frustrating if you're on deadline to not be able to get the answer that you need.
Yeah. It's funny when you said circle back, it reminded me of a particular press secretary And
Circle back.
circled
Yeah.
back, and it became so bad that, it became memes and, and things like that. But for a journalist, they don't want to circle back. They want to write their story, get published.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very cool. So one of the things, as you were talking, I know a lot of copywriters have kind of like frameworks, like Pastor is a frame, different frameworks that help them guide the writing of whatever they're writing. A lot of it's, especially in direct response. Is there a framework that you would recommend for writing a press release?
Yes, it's pretty straightforward. The format and style of a press release. We have lots of samples on our website at eReleases.com. I think if you look in the footer, there's links to press release samples or templates, and they're not very complicated pieces of writing. They are usually between 400 and 600 words. It's just an announcement to the media. You're not writing the article. You're giving them the information in which they can write an article. And the goal is to get that article written. And so you're looking for, a strong headline, a strong opening sentence and paragraph to really grab them in. I recommend an amazing quote in the press release, because one of the things to realize is that if they write an article, based on what your press release is, and they've got that quote by you, you're 100% going to stay in that article as it gets edited by like a managing editor. And if the quote is weak, the managing editor may cross it out and just say, why are we mentioning this company? The quote's not even that strong. And by strong quotes, it can be various different things. It can be like, how you creatively said something. It's just beautiful. But, for the average person, just saying something so condensed and paraphrased so strongly that if they were then to take it out of the quote and paraphrase it themselves, there'd be a loss, an ache of, oh, it was said so much better and succinctly in that quote. And as a result, they're much more likely to keep that quote intact. It is unfortunate, but I've had a few times where a journalist inspires the article gets written, and the company is never mentioned. And if the quote had been stronger, it probably would have preserved their mention in there. The journalist didn't do that out of a slight or anything. Likely the company was there, and the managing editor just crossed it out, just felt that what was said there wasn't important enough to merit inclusion. And that's really disappointing when hey, I am the reason you wrote that article. I didn't get any credit or mention in the article. So a great quote is a way to be there. These things are usually written top down, inverted pyramid, they call it, where you answer the who, what, when, where, how, and why, really the most important elements first. And that's where people succeed or fail with a press release, is what they're announcing, and also what they include in the announcement. And so you really want to make sure that the press release you're writing is strategic and important to the journalist, and the journalist will feel a desire to share it with their audience. They are gatekeepers deciding what will entertain or educate, or even ideally both, their audience. And you want to make sure that you're including elements in your press release that are more likely to do that.
As you were talking, there was something that hit me. As a marketer, I always think about how can we make things easier for our customer. And Amazon is dominant because they wake up every morning trying to figure out how to take the friction out of their customers' lives. And as you were talking, it hit me. I was like, when you're writing a press release, your customer is the journalist. You want to make it easy. I mean, from what I understand, these are busy people that live under deadlines. And if you want to get more press coverage, make their job easier to write about you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. So let's talk a little bit about, e-releases. One misperception that I suspect a lot of people that are listening have, let's say you're running a business that's, doing, 5 million, 10 million in revenue. I could see people saying, oh, press releases, that's what the big C corps do. That's not for me. What would you say to them?
I would say that press releases are a huge opportunity. It is true that a lot of large companies use press releases and they use the wire. In the United States, there's largely a duopoly of news wires that reach journalists, and that is PR Newswire, which is the oldest and largest. And we work with them. They approached us, I think, 15 years ago and liked what we were doing and wanted to support us. And they said, our salespeople would never go after people with budgets so small and do 3 or 4 releases a year. They're chasing people who are doing let's have a multimedia newsroom for $25,000-$30,000, and let's do a Asian distribution with translations for $30,000. And so, but they had suggested that we get a local or state distribution for each of our clients. And I really pushed back and said, hey, these are people looking at national markets. They really deserve a national distribution. And I knew at the time that they charged $1,600 for a national press release of, say, 600 words. And so I knew it was a huge ask. And, they didn't run away, but it was very apparent that they weren't thrilled about offering a national distribution at any price point that we could offer it to our customers. But I went and met them. I discovered that they have an overnight editorial team that's small, but they don't do much. They have to be there in case there's breaking news or recall, world news. And also if people wanted to, like, say, reach the Asian markets and, wanted to be able to move a release so they could coordinate with their bureaus in the Asian countries. And so I suggested that I start scheduling my press releases for next business day. And what that would do is we would send the releases over to them and they could set them up in their systems overnight, and it wouldn't cost them additional labor. And so finally, after that, they agreed to come up with a price point that was affordable for me to be able to offer to all of my customers. So today, and since then, all of our press releases that go over eReleases go out nationally through PR Newswire, and you don't have to pay anything close to $1,600. It's usually like a third or 40% of what the retail price would be if you went to the wire. And that's a really valuable component that you get by using eReleases. And one of our differentiating points is we're the only service out there that offers a national distribution over the wire at such a reduced price. I mentioned the duopoly. The other company that's out there is Business Wire. There was a third company that tried to enter the market, and it's Globe Newswire. And the problem with them is journalists are fishing in 2 oceans, 2 ponds, let's say, Business Wire and PR Newswire. And now they're being asked to go look into a third pond. And what's happened is during that time, journalists are, not doing very well. The industry is dealing with an evolving media market where a lot of businesses are scaling back. And so journalists who used to be asked to write 2 to 3 articles a week are now being asked to write 2 or 3 articles a day. And so the expectation of them to have to then go fish in a third pond, they weren't going to have it. And so Globe Newswire was never able to really get the relationships with journalists and get journalists to go over there. So they pivoted and they said, look, we meet all the SEC disclosures in our distribution. And to be honest, do you really want journalists looking over your numbers and peeling back what's there? And there's a lot of publicly traded companies who go, hey, I like that argument. We really don't need journalists to look at our stuff. We just want to meet disclosure, appear under Yahoo Finance and Market Watch when people type in our stock tickers. So that's sort of been what their focus has been on. Despite that, the marketplace is riddled with probably 40, 50 companies with wire in their names, and they're not actual wires. They don't really have relationships with journalists. A lot of them are involved in syndication, where they take your press release and they replicate it on a bunch of websites. In theory, that sounds good, but the location they are on these websites are not places where a lot of people see it. They often don't appear in Google News or Google Web. And in addition to that, if you went to that news outlet and did a search for something that was in your press release, you don't show up because you're not really in their CMS, content management system, like an article. You're just stuck usually on a subdomain where there's a feed of press releases by headlines. And so, those are distraction. Those aren't earned media. A journalist didn't write an article about you. And so that's where I feel like there's a lot of need for education in the marketplace, and to get people to realize that, You're not going to get articles written about you using these services that are, $59, $89, $120. But the one thing that's common is that 97% of the people that use the real wires, like Pure Newswire and Business Wire, will probably have the same outcome as everybody who uses these lesser wire services. And that's nothing happens. And so, it's competitive, and a lot of people look at what other people do for press releases and they sort of copy them. And there's all of these personnel change announcements, a new hire in HR, and people just send them out and nothing really happens from them. And so, what I do is I get people to focus on the 3% of press releases that do get picked up. And I provide that education back to my customers in hopes that they will do more strategic types of releases and the types of releases that the media is really looking for and responding to.
Yeah. So yeah, kind of as our last question, what type of releases, what do fall into those 3%? Because if I'm going to spend $800-900 sending out a press release, I mean, hopefully I make a little bit more than 800 back off of that. What should be my focus?
So I have a video masterclass where I go into more depth on this, but it's very short. It's like an hour long. It's a great place for anybody who's curious to check it out. It's completely free. It's at ereleases.com/plan, PLAN. And if you're new to PR, it's a great place to start because you can start building a PR campaign of strategic releases. And I guarantee if you do a campaign of 6 to 8 press releases, whether it takes you a year or a year and a half to do all of those, if you sort of follow that, you'll be doing the types of releases that are more likely to get picked up. And you should have at least 2 or 3 press releases in that campaign that do really well and get you earned media. The type of releases are, really honing in on your unique selling proposition and talking about what you do that's different from everybody else. Maybe that's incorporating your story, your journey, being authentic. Could be inspirational, obstacles that you overcame, vulnerabilities, like, something where you suffered a setback or a loss or something along those lines. I mentioned the Shark Tank. It's something that's very common with people that go on there, that they talk about, their setbacks and challenges. And sometimes that could be the lead, especially if you're announcing the company. But if it's an existing company, maybe it's something where you have to bury that story and start with something else. Like maybe at a major milestone, you celebrated, your first 5 years, and then you can share your story and things like that. So contextually, it makes sense. Other things are, using data. For example, we get product launch press releases every day, and they follow this style. Here's a new product. Here's a list of features. Here's a page to learn more. There's nothing there for a journalist to really work with. If they were wanted to be more effective, maybe put a data point in there that's just publicly available. Like, hey, 67% of people in this industry fail within the first 5 years, often because they can't get their logistics cost under control. We offer a logistics software solution, and then talk about that. So it shows the stakes of why your solution is so important. That should better capture people's attention. But even more importantly, there's an opportunity to put a story there. What is a company that beta tested or used this software and had a transformative experience? Share what that company's situation was when they started using the software, and then at the end of it, what the outcome was, and ideally have a quote by them talking about, hey, this, we were really shocked that just by using this solution, we were able to become more efficient, reduce hours, and get cost savings, and as a result, we're just really pleased. But then again, sometimes you can take that quote and make it a little bit stronger, and then send it over for approval, and they go thumbs up. So again, try to make the quote a little bit stronger, especially when it's a third person. Also going back to data, here's a press release that has never failed for anybody that's followed my model, and that is to do a survey within your industry. What are some questions they could ask right now today that people would want to know the answer to? Is it about work culture post pandemic? Is it about people difficulties hiring or facing layoffs? Is, if you were going to a conference or an event with other people in your industry, what are the questions you'd want to ask them? The things that you don't see being addressed in your trade publications, like, hey, have you noticed that net 30 is turning into net 90? Everybody's slow pay. If they go, yeah, that could be like, hey, the money is tightening either within your industry or could be nationally. So, really think about meaningful questions that are timely today. They can be really specific to your industry. AI is really big. So, if I was doing a, a questionnaire of PR professionals, I'd say, do you feel that AI is going to replace your job or, a fundamental part of your job in the next 5 years? Those could be interesting questions. So
This is
use SurveyMonkey to put those questions in. I like 4 questions per page, like 3 pages, 12 questions, or 4th page, 16 questions. Take that link, go to a trade, what is it, a trade association. Pick a smaller independent one. Stay away from the large trade associations, the ones everyone knows, but look for one that has a membership that is similar to your business. And they're out there. I had a PR professional tell me, well, Mickie, that wouldn't work in our industry because there's only Public Relations Society of America. And I was like, well, there's 470 other PR firm trade associations in the United States. And this person didn't know it. And I said, hey, the reason you don't know it is nobody talks about them. They don't get media attention. So if you find one that is aligned with your market and you reach out to them, you just say, hey, could you send this link to your members? We're looking to get at least 100 responses. And in exchange for that, I'll put you in a press release. We'll be issuing over PR Newswire announcing the results of the survey. And about 2/3 of the time, the first association you approach will say yes, just based off of that, because they don't get media attention and they'll see it as a win-win for them. You get the results, you pour over it, and really focus on what question had the biggest surprise. What will shock people when they read that press release, that one question. Focus the press release on that. Potentially you could talk about a second question. Put all the questions and answers on a page on your website, build it out, maybe put some responses, some analysis for each or for certain questions, and link to it in the press release. A journalist may write about what you focus the press release on, but a really great journalists will go and look at the other articles or the other questions, and they might be able to pull out a different article. And then that could be another opportunity where you go, yeah, that was really good. I can't believe I overlooked the importance of that. You could then do a second press release on that. But generally, when people follow this model, they get usually between 8 and 14 articles written about them. And, that's a huge, huge win. The
wow.
least I've ever had. Yeah. The least I've
That
ever had
is
is 4 articles.
wow. That is just that is so powerful. I wish we could keep going. There's a lot more to tap into here. And I know I have more questions for you. And I'm sure the listeners do. How do people reach you?
So the website's eReleases.com. That free masterclass is eReleases.com/plan, PLAN. And all of our social media is on the lower right of our website, and feel free to call, chat, or email us. You'll only talk to editors. We have no salespeople. There's no commissions, no quotas or anything like that. And we're pretty honest that if we feel that what you're working on or anything like that isn't a good fit for PR, we're straight shooters and we'll let you know. And if you do have a press release that you've written and you just want another set of eyeballs on it, we'll do that free of charge, whether you use us or not. Just allow a couple of business days for us to get back to you when you email that over.
All right. Well, hey, Mickie, thanks for sharing all that on Leaders and Legacies.
You're very welcome. Thank you.